Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. The next topic for today is presentation of the second UN report on human rights situation in Crimea. And I give the floor to Ms. Fiona Frazer, head of the UN Human Rights Monitoring Mission in Ukraine.
Ladies and gentlemen, I'm pleased to present this report on the human rights situation in the Autonomous Republic of Crimea and the city of Sevastopol, which covers the period between the 13th of September 2017 and the 30th of June 2018. This is the second such thematic report on Crimea prepared by the UN Human Rights Office as mandated by the UN General Assembly. The UN Human Rights Office, despite diplomatic efforts, continues not to be granted access to Crimea by the Russian Federation, the occupying power. This contradicts the General Assembly's resolutions that affirm that the Crimean Peninsula is a part of Ukraine's territory and urge the Russian Federation to ensure the access of international human rights monitoring missions to Crimea. This report is based on nearly 200 interviews, meetings, and site visits undertaken in mainland Ukraine by the United Nations Human Rights Monitoring Mission. The findings of the report have been analysed under two legal frameworks: international human rights law and international humanitarian law. We, as the Human Rights Office, started to apply international humanitarian law with the introduction in December 2016 of the first General Assembly resolution that recognized the Russian Federation as an occupying power in Crimea. This is important from a legal perspective as well as in practical terms. When a territory is occupied, international humanitarian law automatically gives its residents an additional layer of protection. Geneva Convention 4 imposes specific obligations on the Russian Federation as an occupying power. The obligations include, among others, not to impose its legislation and citizenship in the occupied territory, not to compel the residents of the occupied territory to serve in the army of the occupying power, not to transfer or deport protected persons from the occupied territory, and not to encourage transfers of its own population into the occupied territory. Having analysed the situation in Crimea, we conclude, and it remains one of our key findings, that the Russian Federation has disregarded its international obligations as an occupying power in violation of international humanitarian law. It did impose its legislation on the peninsula and held presidential elections there in March 2018. The Russian Federation did conscript Crimean men into its armed forces, 12,000 since 2015, prosecuting those who did not want to serve. The occupying power did transfer detainees and prisoners to its territory to stand trial or to serve their sentence. And it did deport Crimean residents to mainland Ukraine or third countries. Moreover, the Russian Federation has organized and encouraged parts of its population, in particular state employees, to relocate to Crimea. We call on the Russian Federation to comply with its obligations as an occupying power. Human rights violations also persist in Crimea, with no tangible improvements seen over the last 10 months. We have documented grave human rights violations such as arbitrary detention, torture, abductions, and enforced disappearances, and other violations, including concerns over access to education, quality healthcare, and property rights. Every violation has a human face and a very specific impact on a person's life, his or her health, family, work. The report that we present today details dozens of human rights and international humanitarian law violations. In each of them, there is a human story and often a human tragedy. While every person can potentially become a victim, Crimean Tatars, indigenous people in Crimea, are disproportionately affected. One displaced Crimean Tatar woman we interviewed in Odessa told us, everyone can get into trouble there, especially Crimean Tatars. Crimean Tatars were targeted in about 80% of house searches and Federal Security Service raids on private property in Crimea. Some of them are also suspected of affiliation with Muslim movements that are banned in the Russian Federation, but not in Ukraine. We documented cases when criminal charges have been pressed and sentences imposed, despite the absence of compelling evidence that a person violated public order or engaged in any unlawful activity. This arrest is an attempt to shut our mouths. Those are the words of a Crimean Tatar on trial for alleged membership in a terrorist group. Finally, the Mejlis, a representative institution of Crimean Tatars, has remained banned in Crimea despite an order issued in April last year by the International Court of Justice, which obliges the Russian Federation to lift this prohibition. We urge the Russian Federation authorities in Crimea to end arbitrary searches of private properties belonging to Crimean Tatars and to refrain from enforcing Russian Federation legislation in Crimea. We also encourage the Russian Federation to comply with the International Court of Justice order to lift the ban on the Mejlis. I would like to speak now about 3 individual cases that illustrate a number of violations we have documented, such as arbitrary arrest, restrictions on freedom of expression, and on freedom of religion. My colleagues spoke to Volodymyr Balukh 3 weeks before his arrest in 2016. He told us then, "I will not take a Russian passport, even if they put me in jail." We know what happened afterwards. A Crimean farmer, Volodymyr Balukh, refused to take up Russian citizenship and displayed publicly his pro-Ukrainian views. He was charged and convicted for storing firearms and later for attacking the head of the detention facility where he was held. A court in Crimea sentenced him to 2 consecutive terms for a total of 5 years in prison. This is an example of a documented trend. Arrests and criminal prosecutions appeared to pursue the objectives of sanctioning political dissent and seem designed to serve as a warning to others. Volodymyr Balukh is on a hunger strike now for 178 days. So is filmmaker Oleg Sentsov. Arrested in 2014, transferred to the Russian Federation and convicted of terrorism. Oleg Sentsov went on a hunger strike to protest against what he claims to be politically motivated prosecutions. Today marks 123 days of his hunger strike. The report also speaks about another detainee who used to be on hunger strike, Emir Hussein Kuku. His trial on charges of membership of a terrorist organization is ongoing. Emir Hussein Kuku ceased his hunger strike on the 19th of July. In the report, the UN Human Rights Office raises concerns over the health of all prisoners and detainees, including those on hunger strike. Volodymyr Balukh remains in Crimea, while Oleh Sentsov and Emir Hussein Kuku were transferred to the Russian Federation in violation of international humanitarian law. We urge the Russian Federation to end this practice and to return immediately all detainees transferred from Crimea to the Russian Federation. The report raises concerns about the degrading conditions of detention in the penitentiary facilities of Crimea. I would like to read a quote from the report that describes the situation in Simferopol SIZO, the biggest pre-trial detention center on the peninsula. Overcrowded cells have necessitated sleeping schedules. At times, detainees have been denied food and water before being taken to court hearings or access to necessary medicine. Arbitrary arrests and detentions continued under Russian Federation occupation. Within the past 10 months, we documented 11 arrests that did not have a basis in any existing legal framework. Often, victims were held incommunicado for periods of undocumented detention before any formalized arrest took place. Victims who were released often described physical violence and torture committed against them. Let's now listen to a part of the testimony shared with us by a victim of torture, Renat Paralamov.
И когда я еще попросил адвоката, подошел человек, ударил меня и сказал: вот я твой адвокат, будешь спрашивать адвоката, я буду приходить. Он мне изначально, до того как бить, сказал: у тебя есть немного выбора, один выбор, говорит, либо ты остаешься здоровым, то есть сохраняешь свое здоровье и сотрудничаешь с нами, либо же ты, говорит, потеряешь свое здоровье и все равно будешь с нами сотрудничать. Их начали заново бить, перетянули ремнеподобным чем-то, я просто в мешке был, не помню, так вот сверху затянули рот, чтобы рот закрылся, потому что у меня челюсть писала, и рот не закрывался, и да, речь пропал. И потом заново начали бить током уже намного сильнее, я уже перестал кричать, уже начал молиться.
This man managed to escape, but there are other scenarios too. Within the reporting period, we documented 4 new cases of enforced disappearances, bringing the total number of known cases to 42 since the occupation began. One man, a victim of torture, was threatened by a federal security service officer after he was forced to become an informant. If you tell anyone about our cooperation and what happened to you here, we will simply make you disappear and no one will ever find you. To date, not a single perpetrator has been brought to justice in the cases we have documented of arbitrary arrest, torture, and enforced disappearances. The climate of impunity prevails. Lack of effective investigations and failure to provide redress to victims have further undermined the overall human rights situation in occupied Crimea. The government of the Russian Federation must effectively investigate all allegations of ill treatment, torture, and enforced disappearances, particularly those involving state agents as alleged perpetrators. It has an obligation to ensure accountability and provide redress to victims and their family. An atmosphere of fear persists in Crimea. Fundamental freedoms are stifled. It is not only media under surveillance and pressure, but also individuals for their publications in social media. In one case, and there are more, a Crimean woman was given a suspended prison sentence for sharing a Facebook post that contained criticism of the Russian Federation, its army, and historical figures. Similarly, dissenting voices of peaceful assemblies were not tolerated. The courts fined 80 Muslim men for their simultaneous individual picketing in protest of the arrests of other Muslim men, mostly Crimean Tatars, accused of membership in terrorist or extremist organizations. These single simultaneous pickets were viewed as one public gathering and therefore as requiring pre-authorization in accordance with Russian Federation law. Fear has also prevented people from crossing the administrative boundary line between the peninsula and mainland Ukraine and is believed to be one of the reasons for the declining number of crossings. These fears are grounded. In November 2017, 7 women, all spouses of Crimean Tatar men, under criminal prosecution in Crimea, were stopped and detained for hours by Russian Federation law enforcement officers. This year, we also documented a case when a Crimean Tatar man was detained and tortured by FSB officers at the administrative boundary line. While Ukraine does not have effective control over Crimea, it retains human rights obligations towards those who live there. People originating from the peninsula and its current residents must enjoy unimpeded access to public services in mainland Ukraine. The report describes discriminatory Ukrainian legal provisions, the arbitrary application of legislation, and occasionally prejudiced attitudes by state authorities towards people from Crimea. These have hindered access to various forms of documentation and services in mainland Ukraine, in particular banking and civil registration services. We urge the Ukrainian authorities to respect their human rights obligations in relation to Crimean residents and to use all legal and diplomatic means available to this end. For its part, the UN Human Rights Office will continue to seek ways to access Crimea and to monitor and report on the human rights situation there, pursuant to relevant UN resolutions and our mandate in Ukraine. I thank you for your attention, and I do encourage you to read the report in full. There you will find the full details of what has been said here, and also additional information about property rights, access to quality healthcare, and education in Crimea. Our quarterly reports about the situation in Ukraine also cover the situation in Crimea. The next one will be launched next week on the 19th of September. I'm now open to take questions. Thank you.
Колеги, прошу запитання. Якщо запитань немає,
If there are no questions, now there is one question. Crimean News Agency. In the first report, you indicate at least 20 requirements or requests to the government of the Russian Federation. Has any of those requests been met? That is the question over this period of time.
Thank you very much for your question. Yes, I believe you're talking about the recommendations that we issued in the last report on Crimea. We continue to have a discussion, as I've already raised, from a diplomatic perspective on trying to gain access to Crimea. So that's one of the key recommendations that we're continuing to pursue in line with the GA resolution. And we continue to urge the Russian Federation to implement the recommendations that we've issued, not only in that report, but also in our quarterly reports on the human rights situation in Crimea. And one of the very key ones is, as I've already outlined, to ensure that there is investigation, prompt and effective, into human rights violations that we have documented.
колеги, чи є ще запитання?
Any other questions?
Thank you.